Hello and a very warm welcome to the programme. You will most probably have seen or read about the deaths of 39 people in the UK in the back of a lorry trailer. And that has brought the issue of people smuggling back into the spotlight and the risks that those people are forced into to evade border security. But what if there was another way? Welcome to Roundtable with me, David Foster. Not everybody trying to dodge the passport checks and the sniffer dogs has a valid reason to get to the UK, but campaigners say desperate people, sometimes asylum seekers, are forced into risking their lives because of a lack of safe and legal routes.
From the Great Wall of China to the Berlin Wall, borders have existed throughout time. With the onset of the internet, globalization boomed in the 1990s, and many believed that with the rapid flow of goods, services and people, our world would soon become a global village. But in reality, over the last 30 years, global construction of border structures has tripled. There are now at least 77 walls or fences around the world. And with war and economic inequality, more people are forced to find safety and opportunity across borders. The UN says over 70 million people are now displaced in the world. So what if there were no boundaries? Could the world go borderless?
Very pleased to say that joining us from Denmark we have Gulwali Parsale, a former refugee who escaped turmoil in Afghanistan and fled to the UK in the back of a refrigerated lorry. From Oslo, Katja Franke, Professor of Criminology at the University in that city. And with me in the studio, we have Greg Swenson, who represents US Republicans overseas, and Martina Tazzioli, who works on migration and borders at Goldsmiths University. Great to have you all with us. Gulwali, your book, The Lightless Sky, you can tell us about what you put into that, but I'm pretty sure that reading about the deaths of those 39 people brought an awful lot of terrible memories back for you.
Indeed, it has. So I made the journey from Afghanistan as a child refugee to Britain at the age of 12. It took me a year, went through about 10 countries, unwelcomed, imprisoned, treated terribly. And then getting to the UK wasn't the end. I got to the UK because my brother was supposedly there. It took me 5 years to convince the UK government that I was a genuine refugee. And it was a hellish journey. And going through the bureaucracy and the dehumanizing process was really something. And one of the reasons I wrote The Lightless Sky was to humanize the debate and discussion around refugees and migration and asylum.
And I read in today's national British press, refrigerated truck in Belgium held 12 migrants, 11 Syrians, 1 Sudanese man, found alive in a refrigerated truck in Belgium, police confirmed today. It's a lottery, isn't it?
Well, somewhat. It's very. I mean, what has happened in the UK was, it was shocking but not surprising to me because it happens. It has happened before. It will happen again if we continue with this hostile environment policies and we, continue building fences and walls and preventing people from seeking refuge. I mean, the UK law is that you have to be on the land to claim asylum, but it doesn't provide legal and safe routes for people to come. So then people make, those desperate journeys. The smuggling and trafficking would not exist if it wasn't for the EU and UK government's policies. So I definitely think, we have a responsibility as a country to do more to help those who are fleeing violence, conflict.
I will ask you about what it was like in the back of that lorry, but a little bit later in the programme. But the reaction to your story, because you've been on the news quite a lot, has been mixed, hasn't it?
Well, yes. I mean, people are very supportive in welcoming of refugees. The majority of people, when I travel across Britain, I see people are very generous and kind, but there are a small minority of people, especially on social media and Twitter, they've been very hateful, and they come with messages and comments which is basically full of fear and hatred for people like me. And I mean, there was no sense of sympathy or empathy towards those 39 people who lost their lives, the innocent souls. There was all sorts of things around, those are illegal immigrants, we should tighten our borders, we shouldn't welcome them, or we should deport them back, or people were saying things like, if you make illegal journeys, that's the consequences. I mean, it's so much inhumanity, and it's just heartbreaking.
The fact is that the more you tighten borders, the more you are always going to get illegal activities, and hence you are going to get more situations like this.
Yes, this is completely right. Borders create a particular economy So strictly controlled borders, they produce a clandestine economy, which on the one hand creates profits, great profits for some actors. Those profiting from it are not only illicit actors organizing clandestine border crossings, but also various actors providing security systems and so on. And on the other hand, this kind of economy creates losers, people who are, for various reasons, trying to cross borders irregularly. And for them, borders create systematic conditions of vulnerability, and for some, also loss of life. And this is inevitable. This is not. So I completely agree that the tragedy in Essex should not be surprising, and it is not unique either. A similar thing happened. 71 migrants were found dead in 2015 in Austria, its border with Hungary. 4 of them children. I mean, this is not unprecedented.
OK, so let's bring it back to the studio. And as I say, please say anything you want at any time. I'll be watching you. Greg, Martina, Greg, you first of all. Who benefits from a border?
Well, and I think they're obviously necessary to manage the ingress and egress from a country. And obviously the country that benefits the most is the country that's protecting its border. That's sometimes a good thing, but it's also sometimes exaggerated and used for evil purposes. Look, the classic border protection was the Soviet Union and East Germany and the Eastern Bloc states that wouldn't let their citizens leave the country. And you can point to North Korea and Cuba right now as the same way. So, look, I think they're necessary in civilization to...
They're a fairly new concept, though, aren't they? I mean, 150, 200 years ago, there were very few nation states. People could travel mostly pretty freely. They've been brought in to make particular countries exclusive rather than inclusive.
Sure.
It's going to be difficult to join our club.
Yeah, well, it has to be managed. And I think there's always been a process. It's hard for me to speak about the UK because I've only been here for 4 years. But, you know, in the US, there's always been a process to enter the country. I think everyone has to be reminded is that incentives matter. And incentives are important on both sides of the border in this case. So if you have a combination of open border and welfare, it usually leads to some sort of, chaotic entrance into the country, but also it doesn't work.
People involved
Sure.
at that point. They're thinking about protecting the system from outsiders, making it more difficult. Is anybody thinking about the human side of this?
I think there are a significant number of people who are, and I think it's important that it's done in a humanitarian way, and I think it's very important that we protect the people that are trying to get into any country, or there should be movement of people. But look, there has to be proper incentives, and I think one of the problems is the incentive to move, for example, from Africa into Europe is something that has to be managed. One of the ways to manage it is to improve the conditions on the ground in those countries. I know that sounds very idealistic, but I think the best thing you could do is not necessarily make it so everybody wants to move to 3 places. We all know that there's always been great incentive to move to America. It's always been that sort of land of opportunity that people around the world aspire to, and that's great. That's patriotic. That's a good thing. But it's got to be managed so it doesn't end up being a disaster.
This is the point, really.
Yeah.
Nobody's worked it out because, as I said, it's a relatively new concept. 55.2% of borders created in the 20th century, 37% in the 19th century. That's more than 92% of borders that we have now are a concept of at least the last 200 years. Therefore, it's never really been worked out how best, Martina, to treat people and national interests together.
I think that what we are witnessing today is an increase in the politics of migration containment that we have never witnessed before, although there is a quite long history of border enforcement that should be traced back to the late 19th century. But definitely since the oil crisis, the border restriction imposed on non-European citizens has increased, and in particular, the implementation of a global visa regime that makes borders unequal. This is, I think, the main problems, not borders as such, but the fact that borders are not equal to everyone. So as an Italian citizen, for instance, I can move relatively easy to Tunisia, but also I could come to the UK to improve my life and to find
But
a
if
job.
you were Tunisian...
Exactly, this is the asymmetries.
Yeah,
This is part of the asymmetries.
This is what I wanted to say, because the question is a world without borders possible? And thinking about this, I suddenly realised that a world without borders, in a sense, already exists if you happen to have money. Let's take a look at this. Golden visas, it's called. St. Kitts, $150,000. Dominica, about 400,000. Cyprus, 2.15 million euros. That way you get European citizenship. And the list goes on and on and on. It's unequal, isn't it?
It is very much so, and I think this is one of the main characteristics of borders today. They're extremely stratified. They have very different effects on different groups of people, depending on which country you come from, how wealthy you are. So you can come from a poor country but be wealthy, and in that way buy yourself global mobility. And then even citizens of European countries, poorer European countries, then can experience much harsher border controls because of their poverty. So I think borders are extremely stratified along the lines of wealth.
So why
race,
do we
yes.
live in a world where the rich can buy citizenship? And I'm looking at another one here, Antigua and Barbuda, $100,000 citizenship and passport. A world where the rich can buy what they want, but desperate people are turned away.
I think citizenship is a privilege in the contemporary world. It is something that is has a great price because it means a lot, especially citizenship in a country like Norway or other European countries, Germany, Sweden, and so on, which still have functioning welfare systems and so on. And also citizenship can buy global mobility. With a UK passport, still you can move relatively freely and so on.
Gulwali, you've been here. Greg, I will come to you in a second.
Sure.
Gulwali, you've been here, what, about 12 years now. You might remember, or you might have heard the old English ditty which goes, it's the rich what gets the pleasure, it's the poor what gets the pain. It's the same the whole world over, ain't it all a crying shame? It is so unequal, isn't it?
Indeed, I think equality is one of the main problems we are experiencing this issue. But one of the reasons, the problem I have is we are protecting borders rather than protecting people, and that's the issue. It's a moral argument, it's a humanitarian argument for me. The issue where you were born is an accident of birth. I was born in Afghanistan, it wasn't my fault, and you were born in Britain or elsewhere, that's your accident of birth, and that gives you privileges, that gives you influence.
If border controls were more lax, perhaps fairer in the eyes of many people, would fewer people die? And also your suggestion that we have safe routes is effectively giving people a motorway to the countries they want. Gulwali, then we'll open that one up, yeah?
Yes, well, what I'm suggesting is the refugee sectors in the refugee charity suggested that we need a safer and legal routes for people to travel, particularly from Europe, people who want to come to the UK because of family reunification, because they have other reasons and they need international protection. We were supposed to take 3,000 unaccompanied minors from Europe under the Doves Amendment, which was a thing in the UK, and then we managed to take 300 or so and then made a U-turn. It was perfectly possible to take children from France and Greece and Italy who needed help and support.
But I'm saying it's never going to happen that there is a frictionless way of getting out of a country you don't want to live in into one that you really want to. I will come back to you. But I want everybody to join in on this one.
Sure.
Look, it's difficult, and I think if you open the floodgates, if you open the borders, and had at the same time, as I said earlier, a welfare state, there would be such incentive to move in. And we see even in the U.S., where there's a welfare state in California, and there's a herd mentality to move in there because they have the incentive. So they don't have the proper incentive to stay home.
But these people are also givers as well as takers, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think that's one of the reasons that countries like the UK ask for either contributions, they basically sell citizenship or sell visas, or they at least want to know that you're not going to come in and become dependent on the welfare state. Is that unpleasant? Of course it is, but it's also fair. It's fair to the taxpayers that are here paying the taxes, and
who by an accident of birth, an accident of history, happen to have been born in this country, where perhaps their forebears were the people who imposed colonial rule on a different country. And thereby,
it's not always fair, but you look at what's been the greatest eradicator of poverty in the world has been capitalism. One of the flaws with capitalism is there's some inequality. That's just how it works. David Mamet said that when he became a conservative, you know, that the alternative to inequality is bread lines. How'd that work out in the Soviet Union, and how's it working out in Cuba?
I very much agree that, just to continue, that is not only a question of protecting human beings, but also of providing equal possibility to access mobility. But of course, this is not the only solution, in the sense that if inequalities persist, there are problems will continue, right? So I think that the reason why there are these privileged access to citizenship is also in part also because the colonial history of some countries. And in terms of people who are currently risking their lives to come to Europe, what is important to know is that in order to seek asylum, the only possibility for them is to become illegal and to illegally cross the Mediterranean or to illegally cross via Turkey and to put their lives at risk.
We talked about the moral argument, or it was mentioned earlier, rather than just the practical one. And I wonder whether, in fact, borders are there to show how we judge other people.
Borders are mirrors, I would say, also, I mean, as a good lens for studying how states are transforming their own way of enacting sovereignty. So in this sense, I think that it's particularly important in this moment to study borders as a lens for understanding this geopolitical transformation.
So borders principally came in, I think, probably in the early 1920s as nationalism was spreading across Europe. We've seen a rise of it fairly recently. Katja, what do you think about the fact that I read somewhere that I think about 30, 40 years ago, or maybe a bit more than that, there were only 7 walls separating people. Now there are 90 plus across the world. What does that say about where we've gone?
Well, it says a lot about the way the world is going. It is towards stricter border control. So I think the question is not only whether there were borders before or not, but the measures we use today to control borders, and building walls are some of the measures, have become more militarized. So I think what has happened, in particular in the past 2 decades, that we have taken into use more militarized modes of border control, of policing and so on, which have produced also greater migrant mortality. So even though borders have existed for most part of the 20th century, we haven't used the same types of measures to control them, which is, I think, quite important. The ways we control borders today are not inevitable or not necessary. They are a result of particular political efforts.
I stood on the East German-West German border once as a younger reporter and looked across it, and it was explained to me that there was a ditch that had mines in it, there were the machine guns, there were the dogs, there was the electric wire. Are we moving more towards that? We're going to keep you out. In that case, it was keep you in, actually. We're going to keep you out pretty much at any cost.
Well, it would seem like that. And I think both that system of border control and the one we're building today runs contrary to what is not only when it comes to moral rights, but also to legal rights. The UN Declaration of Human Rights clearly states that everyone has the right to leave any country, and including his own, and also to return to his country. And it also has the right to seek asylum. So these are also not just moral obligations, but they're legal ones to which Western countries and most countries in the world are sort of have signed to.
I will come to you, Greg, in a minute, but Gulwali, you've been very patient for a little while. I don't know what you want to add to that, but I want to ask you about your book, The Lightless Sky. And in view of what we now know, I want to ask you what you thought when the doors of the container into which you were put as a refugee shut behind you.
David, I mean, there are 70 million displaced people in the world. 1 in 111 people are displaced. About 25 million are refugees. Majority of people choose to stay in their own countries. And I think Greg is somewhat, I respectfully disagree with him, People don't just leave because of incentives, because of benefits, because of whatnot. People leave because of persecution. People leave because they don't have choice. I mean, there may be some people who move for economics reasons. There's nothing wrong. And there are a lot of people who move because they are refugees. They need, claiming asylum is not a crime, as mentioned. So in my case, the container, the refrigerator journey was the last stage of the journey after going through about 8 countries or so, 10,000 miles. And I crossed to Britain on the back of a refrigerator lorry from Calais, the jungle. It was a very miserable place. It was not fit for humans. And I could see England. I was so close, yet I was so far. And I did not understand the risk that I was taking when I got into that container, when the door was closed behind me. But I knew if the driver had put on the freezer, we would have killed on the last leg of our journey. So it was kind of scary. And whenever I see tragedies and people, dying or drowning on the Mediterranean and people dying in containers, it resonates. It brings back memory. I could have easily been one of those people. So my heart goes out to the families of the loved ones who lost those people who left their family and loved one for a better future. I mean, either the people from Vietnam or from anywhere. I mean, they had their reasons, and we ought to be showing compassion.
And I'll come to you to end the show, because I've got a specific question for you, Gulwali, but I want to bring it back to the other three at the moment. Greg, you've been dying to say something, but my question to you is, how do you stop more people dying?
Yeah, it's really sick what happened. And I think, first of all, you have to start with the actual criminals that are starting those journeys from the get-go. I mean, and that's been happening, in North Africa with the rafts coming across the Mediterranean. First, you have to really stop those people. They're really sick, and that has to be addressed. I know I mentioned incentives before. It's not just economic incentives. We view America as the land of opportunity. It's also a country of ideals. And one of those ideals is that we welcome people who are claiming asylum. It's not just, I need food on the table or I can get a better job in America. That's important and that's great. But I think we have to remind ourselves.
How do you stop more people dying?
Oh, it's got to be done with law enforcement, both in the country of origin as well as at the borders.
Not by changing the borders, not by making it easier for people to get in, perhaps?
It could often create more chaos, and then what happens when they get in, right? So you have to have rule of law. That's one of the things that makes America and the UK and many of the countries in Western Europe great, is there is rule of law. And it's if you look at the economic and other freedoms in the world, the ones that lead the charge are the ones that have rule of law and property rights.
Martina,
and we can't
are we ever going to
sacrifice that.
see a world without borders?
So, first of all, I think that we need to open more safe channels to come to Europe, right? And the reason why there are people dying is because it's more and more difficult to come in a legal way to Europe. And also, if you want to work and to study in Europe, so the increased number of people who die and who seek asylum, so the increased number of asylum seekers, it depends on this border restriction, right? And I think that one of the first things to do is to open safe channels to come, and the second...
But politicians in Germany, politicians in Austria, in Italy, have seen what happens if they do this, if they take more and more migrants. They've seen the country's people turn against them. So are we ever going to see, not a borderless world, but a world with fewer borders? My suggestion is probably not.
Yeah, probably not, but the problem is how borders work and how they are enforced. For instance, I think that the murderous agreement with Libya that Italy signed and that is about to renew is producing more and more migrant deaths, because it forces migrants to undertake more dangerous routes and to expose themselves to risk at sea. Yeah. So people won't stop crossing. And if they stop, it's only because they are detained in Libya. So the European Union is detaining them in an unsafe place.
Yeah. We don't have very much more time. And Katja, I would come to you. I hope you feel we've given you enough time, but I want to give the last word on this to somebody who's been through that terrible journey. Gulwali, every time you see a story about migrants either coming out of the back of a lorry alive or unfortunately losing their lives as a result of it, you are reminded, I imagine, of your family back home.
Yes, of course. I mean, I've not seen my mom and my family for the last 12 years. And people have to understand that refugees sacrifice so much, and their family do as well. If there wasn't a war in Afghanistan, in Britain and America did not bomb and invade and occupied my country, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have to risk my life. Afghans used to be the largest refugee population in the world and the largest asylum seekers in Europe. Now we're the second largest because of the conflict that's been happening, not only in the last 18 years, but in the last 35 to 40 years. There was a Save the Children report out recently which said every child born in Afghanistan have known nothing but war. And so we need to be doing a lot more in ending wars. And at least, I mean, Britain and America are always very good in intervening and causing wars. I mean, look at what's happening in Yemen, what's happening in Syria.
Just
Iraq,
on a personal level, I'm wondering about your mother back in Afghanistan. Does she choose not to leave? Has she been told that she cannot leave? Would she find it difficult to get into the UK if things got worse or easier, I suppose, since you left?
I mean, it's very difficult to get, family reunification in the UK. The laws are basically almost impossible. And I hope there will be peace in Afghanistan one day. There'll be security, so I could return and play a positive role in rebuilding that country. I mean, nobody wants to be a refugee. No one wants to be, labeled as the other and the different and unwelcome, not belonged. So even though Britain is my second home, even though it's my adopted country, but ultimately Afghanistan is home. And I want to be, if I want to be anywhere, I want to be with my loved ones. And people need to get that. And I hope people will understand that you wouldn't leave your family and home without an extraordinary circumstances.
OK, listen, thank you. I wish we had more time. Thank you very much indeed. Looked like you were desperate to say something more.
Always am.
Greg, thank you.
Thank you.
Just one thing I would like to leave you with. I mean, we didn't talk very much about security within a nation's borders and whether, in fact, that is one reason why people are so strict about who comes and goes. When it comes to security, the majority of terrorist attacks are committed by somebody from that country, not somebody from outside. So perhaps that's another one of those arguments thrown to one side. From me, David Foster, from my guest, thank you very much for taking part. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time on Roundtable. Goodbye for now.